introduce our guest, Frank Figliuzzi, today. One second. There he is. Hello, Frank. Welcome back. I think you're on mute. Try it again. Yep, we can hear you now. But I want to introduce Frank Figliuzzi, our guest today, who's been a great supporter of our program. And I've lost count now of how many presentations you've given us, but we really appreciate the continued support. And Frank Figliuzzi has served 25 years as an FBI special agent and retired as its head of counterintelligence. He's the best-selling author of The FBI Way, Inside the Bureau's Code of Excellence, and a popular national security analyst for NBC News. He's here to talk today about his new podcast, The Bureau with Frank Figliuzzi, where he sits down weekly with active duty FBI personnel as they share their mission, their cases, and their lives. So with that, Frank, I'll let you take it over, and welcome again so much.
Scott, thank you for the introduction and for having me on again. I take it the repeat invitations are an indication that I haven't screwed up too badly in the past. I also want to thank all of our guests, both from Arizona and outside the state, who are joining us today. I'm excited about today's topic. And I also get excited whenever I get a chance to answer questions. I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions, maybe even an atypical amount of time for questions, because I always find that a topic like the FBI generates a lot of questions. And if somebody's got something on their mind, it's likely that 10 or 20 other people attending have the same question. So that's what I'm here for today. Today's purpose, what I'd like to do with your good graces, is take us inside today's FBI. It's really our FBI. If we pay taxes, then we're helping to fund the FBI, the nation's premier law enforcement and intelligence agency, and it does wear both those hats. It's a unique hybrid of a law enforcement agency and an intel agency. We'll talk about that some more. As Scott alluded to, and as many of you know, because you might have attended a previous discussion with me, I have written a national bestseller that came out in January. It's called The FBI Way, Inside the Bureau's Code of Excellence. And I felt the need to write that book because over the course of the last several years, many in the public were developing a perception that was misleading about the Federal Bureau of Investigation for any number of reasons. And I felt compelled to say, you know what, here's how the rank and file men and women get up every day and go about the task of protecting our nation. And the goal of the book was to not only educate about the FBI, but to also take about 25 years worth of lessons I had learned as an FBI agent about how the FBI operates while under extreme stress, almost on a daily basis, but does so at a high level of excellence most of the time. They are far from perfect. And those of you who've read the book know the book is not about the FBI being perfect, but rather about performing at a high level through something called values-based performance. And the concept is that when you lead with values, you often are far more successful at your leadership, whether it's leading a family, a homeowners association, a classroom, a team, or a large company or organization. So why am I mentioning the book? Because it's a segue into something else that's now developed beyond the book, and that is a podcast offer that came my way. So many of you may be podcast listeners. Some of you may have thought about becoming a podcast listener, and I know Scott's going to make available, if he hasn't already, some instructions to everyone on what a podcast is and how to go about getting one. But a podcast is an audio product that allows you, boy, there are thousands and thousands of them out there. I was not a particularly big podcast listener before this offer came to me. But I thought I know my adult sons listen to podcasts. That's often how they get their information or entertainment. They have their favorites, from very serious podcasts on health and fitness to lighter fare that's out there. And my podcast, which we launched in May, has now become one of the top 25 in the true crime category. It's called simply The Bureau with Frank Figliuzzi. In fact, if you're wondering about it, if you simply get on the internet and Google The Bureau with Frank Figliuzzi, you'll see various podcast platforms come up. It's available on Apple and Google Podcasts and Spotify and iTunes and all of the places you might get podcasts. Pick one and start listening. We're almost through with our first season. And you can, the neat thing about podcasts that boy, have I learned a lot about the podcast business, is people go back and catch up on old episodes. It's kind of like doing that on Netflix. Hey, I want to go back and catch some earlier episodes that I missed. Here's the podcast in a nutshell, and then we're going to go into it in quite some depth as I share even what I have learned about today's FBI since I retired back in 2012. The neat thing about the podcast is that it's unprecedented. The FBI has never permitted someone outside of the FBI to every week interview, have access to active duty FBI personnel that are able to discuss their mission, their cases, their lives, and to do so in a way that shares with us corners, some dark corners of the FBI that we've often wondered about or we never even knew about. And the comments and feedback I'm getting are, I never knew this about the FBI. This was fascinating. I had no idea we'd gotten here, or I had no idea the FBI did this or had people who did it. And that means it's successful if that's the feedback that we're getting. The FBI is committed to a second season. The first season was 12 episodes. We're going to try to do 12 again. We're on this week. We'll release episode 10, and we're already starting to record a second season with some pretty neat topics. And at the end of this, start scratching down some topics that you might want to see covered in a podcast with an FBI guest about some things you've always wondered about, because I'm going to be asking you your idea about potential topics for the next season. And so we release this every Tuesday, a new episode. And tomorrow we'll put out yet another episode of The Bureau with Frank Figliuzzi. So before we talk about today's FBI, I thought we'd start, as they say at the beginning, which is to talk a little bit about the history of the FBI. We really can't catch up to speed unless we start with how the FBI was founded and some really brief history. So look, the date celebrated for the inception of the FBI is usually July 26, 1908. That's when President Roosevelt responded to a request from his then Attorney General to consolidate various investigative units under one person and begin with a professional cadre of about 34 investigators. That's how it started. They didn't even have the power of arrest at that time. They didn't have guns at that time, but they were special investigators. They were agents, but not yet special agents. A lot of questions come to me about, hey, how come FBI agents are called special agents? What's so special about them? The answer is they were designated special agents when eventually they were given the power of arrest. That was a legal designation that applied to people with power of arrest. The group started being called the Bureau of Investigation, and it was only later on when a very young man, a man in his 20s by the name of J. Edgar Hoover, started leading that small group that it then became designated as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. And as I said, eventually Hoover's investigators were allowed to carry weapons and authorized to actually arrest people. That's when they were designated special agents. You say, well, wait a minute, you mean at some point they weren't allowed to arrest people? And here's how that worked very awkwardly. They would literally investigate a case. When it came time to put handcuffs on somebody, they'd have to call the local police department wherever they were working and ask, pretty please, if this person could be detained. on federal charges. Sometimes the police said, no, we don't know what that means, federal charges. What are you talking about? We don't have the authority. Sometimes they said yes. It got very unwieldy. And look, history tells us there were a lot of things going on in our country at that time that really necessitated an elite group of federal level investigators who could travel across state lines. American cities were growing by leaps and bounds. Crime was becoming rampant. The gangster era eventually took hold. You've all heard the names: Pretty Boy Floyd, John Dillinger, and then much later Al Capone, all challenging the ability and the authority of local and state police because they couldn't cross state lines. And this newfangled contraption called the automobile was being used by gangsters to commit crimes. And the local police couldn't get out of their jurisdiction. The state police couldn't cross a state line. And, sometimes I draw the analogy between the early days of the automobile and crime and what we're facing today with regard to cybercrime. It's now global, crossing international lines, and it's creating a heck of a challenge for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. So kind of imagine that at an automobile state line level back then, and you'll understand why the Attorney General went to Roosevelt and said, we need a group of people who can do this and tackle these problems. But it wasn't just gangster crime. Public corruption was out of control. You can remember the Tammany Hall scandal, and politicians everywhere from New York to New Orleans, just with their hand out and accepting bribes and soliciting bribes, city, state officials at all levels. And someone needed to tackle that. And then there were the national security challenges. At the time, our country had anarchists, saboteurs were blowing things up inside the country. Big business was functioning corruptly in their factories and meat processing facilities. And again, someone needed to take this on. Congress recognized that and began to fund this small unit of men. And I say men because they were indeed all male for quite some time. And I can't emphasize enough this hybrid nature, even today, of the FBI, both law enforcement and intelligence mission, counterterrorism, counterintelligence, national security, cyber, organized crime, white collar crime, civil rights violation, organized crime, violent crime. They seemingly do it all. They're in the news every single day. And our allies, many countries of the world simply don't do it this way. They have separate agencies. So there may be folks today participating who are Canadian citizens. The Canadians don't have this hybrid agency. They have the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, for law enforcement matters. And they have CSIS for their security and intelligence service for the sensitive national security matters. But when it's time for CSIS, much like the FBI in 1908, when it's time for CSIS to end their investigation, they've caught a spy, someone committing espionage, or even a terrorist, they've got to call the cops to place somebody under arrest. The Brits do it very, very similarly. There's MI5 domestically, which is a rough equivalent of the FBI, but I emphasize rough because they do not have a gun amongst them in MI5. They do not have the power of arrest. They are experts at what they do, tracking terrorists and spies, surveillance experts like I've never seen before, but they've got to call the police when it's time for arrest. And when you have a beer with these folks in Canada or in the UK, as I've had a few in my day, they will tell you they envy the seamless hybrid nature of the FBI. There's a force multiplier there. When you work criminal matters like drugs and organized crime, you develop so much more intelligence about the national security side and vice versa. So it's a powerful agency. It requires a lot of monitoring and congressional oversight, and they don't always get it right, but they're committed to excellence. So a lot of people on this national security issue, I think when you ask a lot of people, hey, what was the precursor to the CIA, right? The CIA is our National Intelligence Collection agency, largely functioning outside the United States, gathering information of use to national security interests. No power of arrest. They are intelligence collectors. And you ask people, what was the precursor to the CIA? You'll often get pretty savvy people telling you, well, it was this thing called the OSS with Wild Bill Donovan, the Office of Security Services or Special Security. And that's true, but it's not the whole story. The very first foreign intelligence collectors, the very first government agents in the United States assigned overseas to collect intel in foreign countries were actually FBI agents. Again, it was President Roosevelt who, when he realized we had no real collection ability overseas, looked around and saw this group of investigators who were used to developing sources, preventing bad things from happening. And he called Hoover into the White House and he said, I need you to post some people in these following countries and stop certain things from happening and be our eyes and ears on the ground. Those were FBI agents. Hoover had no idea what he was talking about with regard to this mission, but he knew he had good people, and they became very successful overseas as foreign intelligence collectors, particularly in Latin America at the time. All right. Another thing that I always cover is where the FBI sits in terms of our government structure. And all of you know the three branches of government: executive, judicial, and legislative. There's sometimes a mistake, particularly when I talk to kids in school groups. They'll look at the FBI and they'll go, and I'll ask the question, which branch of government do you think the FBI sits in? And very often they'll say judicial because that sounds right to them. It sounds like the FBI must be part of the court system or something like that. And of course, that's not quite right. It is part of the executive branch of government. And more particularly, it is a portion of the US Department of Justice. So the FBI director answers to the Attorney General of the United States. The FBI director is not a cabinet level official. It's a sub-cabinet position. And DOJ is a very large agency that includes all of the US attorneys' offices throughout the United States. All the federal prosecutors are part of DOJ. And there are other law enforcement agencies that are part of DOJ. For example, the US Marshals Service, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and of course, the entire Federal Bureau of Prisons sits within the Department of Justice. Now, as a law enforcement agency, the FBI represents the largest line item in the Department of Justice budget. That's often a source of great envy in the sister agencies that the FBI works alongside, but it's just the reality of the mission and size and scope of the agency. For those of you who are the accounting nerds, if you're wondering what that looks like in terms of a budget item, it's roughly about $8 billion a year to run the entire FBI. And some of those line items are highly classified. And in fact, there's a very classified portion of what the FBI does in terms of budget. And in fact, I had a large portion of that when I was assistant director for counterintelligence. Something else that I think many people don't realize, although with all of the news in the past 4 or 5 years, it's come more to the forefront, and that is that the FBI director serves a 10-year term. That's on purpose. That is an attempt, and some would say perhaps a failed attempt at this point when we've had an FBI director fired by a past president. But it's an attempt to keep the FBI as neutral, as apolitical, and as objective as humanly possible. That is vital for the preservation of the FBI's mission. And so the thought was, if we appoint this director for 10 years, they will not necessarily serve at the pleasure of a president, but they will straddle administrations. And again, that's so that you don't see law enforced at the whim of a president or someone deciding that they want this enforced this week, but not enforced next week. Let's talk about the size and scope of the Bureau before we get into the various podcast episodes that have caused me to learn some things here at my advanced age. All right, so size. There are currently 56 field offices in the FBI throughout the United States. And some large states have more than one. That accounts for the 56. Some states have such small populations that they don't actually have a full-blown field office, but rather they have a satellite office that are called, these satellite offices are called RAs, or resident agencies, that answer to larger field offices somewhere else. Here in Arizona, there's one large field office and then a number of satellite offices. So for example, the headquarters city field office here in Arizona is Phoenix, and there are satellite offices, or RAs, in places like Tucson and other places. And in fact, the Tucson satellite office, the Tucson resident agency, is so large, it has its own satellite offices, some of whom handle Indian country matters. And we're going to talk about that as well as an episode dedicated to Indian country and reservation law enforcement. Now, here's the part where most people are surprised. I told you there are 56 field offices inside the United States. The surprise is, to many, that the FBI has over 60 offices overseas. So a lot of people look askance at that and go, well, wait a minute. I thought it was the CIA outside the United States and the FBI inside the United States. But here's the issue. As we all have learned, crime has literally become global, largely because of the computer, but almost all crime on a federal level these days has become global, has some international aspect to it. So these aren't necessarily very large offices, although the largest offices are in allied countries such as the UK and Canada by far. But they're crucial to getting the FBI's mission accomplished. So again, these FBI agents will not have power of arrest in those countries. We don't want that happening. They don't serve an intelligence function, so to speak, like the CIA. They're not spying. We don't want FBI agents spying in other countries. But they do serve a very powerful law enforcement liaison function. So on a very simple level, even in my career as a young agent, if I needed an interview done in one of my own investigations, I started my career in Atlanta, Georgia, because of course the FBI in its infinite wisdom sent a Connecticut Yankee to the Deep South, which I cover in my book, by the way. If I needed an interview done in London or in Mexico City or in Buenos Aires, I would simply cut a lead, to use some FBI vernacular, and send a cable to our legal attaché. They're called legal attachés. So it doesn't say FBI on the door. If you were to get a business card from one of these agents overseas, it would say legal attaché. And they operate inside the US embassies and consulates. That's where their office is. And those of you who have ever been posted overseas in any capacity know that a US embassy is essentially a microcosm of the entire US government. You'll see DEA in there and ATF, certainly CIA, of course, all run by State Department and the ambassador. But there's now over 60 FBI offices overseas. It's really a fascinating program. And we devoted an entire episode of the podcast to that, which I'll talk about in a second. It's become one of the most popular episodes of the podcast. Imagine packing up your family, coming home announcing, I've been assigned to Frankfurt, Germany, or Madrid, Spain, or Rome, Italy. Those are the kind of nicer accompanied spots, London, Paris. Then there are unaccompanied spots, including combat theaters. There are FBI legal attaché offices in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, certainly throughout the Middle East, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, and covering the United Arab Emirates, and all of the stans, Kazakhstan, and on, and even even imagine this assignment as an FBI agent, even legal attaché offices in places like Moscow and Beijing. And imagine that cop to cop law enforcement liaison going on while you're under surveillance 24/7 in your residence, in your business dealings, trying simply to solve crimes internationally while you're operating in an adversarial environment. Fascinating, fascinating work. How big is the FBI population-wise? So I want to put this in perspective. The number of sworn gun and badge law enforcement personnel in the New York City Police Department, NYPD, is somewhere like 36, 38,000 police officers to cover the 5 boroughs of New York City. The FBI covers the entire United States, and as we've just said, the world, with a total of 14,000 gun and badge special agents and a total employee population of 36,000, still smaller than the sworn cadre of police officers at NYPD. Just some perspective. Now, in some ways, that's apples and oranges, correct? But wanted to give you some size references there. Now, that means you might say, well, now that's interesting. You're telling me that the minority of employees inside the FBI are actually special agents with a gun, a badge, and power of arrest. And the answer is correct. That's right. So the majority of employees are not agents. The majority are professional specialists across about 400 job descriptions, from auto mechanic working the fleet of automobiles throughout the country, to linguists and PhD scientists and intelligence analysts, which has become the really hot position since 9/11. Those people who connect the dots between crimes, between terrorists, between nations and cases and squads within an office. Surveillance specialists who do nothing but national security surveillance, very, very classified work, but can't look like that kind of stereotypical FBI agent. If you're following spies around all day and night, you don't want to look like you're an FBI employee. Those people are not gun and badge carrying agents who do the national security surveillance. Then they're extremely trained at what they do. You and I could follow somebody around all day, and at the end of the day, if we're asked if we saw any suspicious activity, we would shrug our shoulders and say no. These folks will tell you, I saw 3 brush passes. I saw somebody dry cleaning themselves for 4 hours. I saw an exchange of cash at the bottom of a telephone pole, and I saw a signal being marked, none of which you or I might have picked up. That's how trained these people are. There are fingerprint examiners. There are computer forensic examiners. Boy, is that a hot area right now. And if you've got young people in your life, grandkids, or anybody interested in where they're heading career-wise, I've got to tell you, computer forensic exam, computer security is the way to go. The FBI has nurses. All the major field offices have nurses. There are victim witness specialists who do incredible work, working with all of the witnesses, all of the victims of tragedies and crimes, staying with them right through prosecution, appeal, and beyond. And many, many, many more. And I just say there's something for everybody in the FBI. There truly is. I get asked sometimes about numbers and demographics, and I'm told that right now the agent population, that's again the special agent population, is somewhere between 15 and 20% female. And the FBI executives will openly admit, as they did to me. We did an episode, if you're wondering, how do you know this, Frank? Well, we did an episode on that. We're going to have an episode released in the 2nd season on recruiting efforts. And pretty much they they admit they've got to do much better on this. Look, a law enforcement, the same goes for race and gender, by the way. A law enforcement and intelligence agency has to look like the community, or in the FBI's case, the nation that they're trying to protect. You simply can't get the job done if you don't understand the culture, if you don't look like the environment, and it's simple. It's just real simple, practical things. People won't necessarily talk to you, relate to you. Certainly people won't become an informant if they don't trust you, if they don't see you as someone that understands them. And again, the challenge of surveillances in urban environments, all of this speaks to the need for diversity. And they're really working hard. They've now announced a recent partnership with historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs. And the HBCU organization has named the FBI one of the top employers for graduates from historically Black colleges and universities. They're expecting a lot out of this initiative, this partnership and program. And I hope they get there, because there's a lot of competition out there for talented people of all shapes and sizes. All right, let's go now to the podcast. And I will tell you, it is no small task to create and produce a podcast that involves active duty FBI personnel. As you can imagine, these folks and the institution itself are not exactly volunteering to make public, to go on public from anywhere from half an hour to an hour and chat about their work and their lives. But it's been fascinating to watch the development of this, because as the comfort level has grown within the FBI with this podcast, and they see the results, right? You know, we've had our first episode, we had 50,000 downloads, and they see that this is actually resonating with people, and that I didn't bite anybody's head off, that I'm simply there. I'm not there to talk politics, God forbid. I'm there to say, tell us about what you do, ask some logical questions, and let people listen to what this person's mission is, and what the developments are and challenges in today's FBI. So as they see that, we start going from nobody getting interested, no one showing any interest in being interviewed, to everybody now raising their hands going, I want to do that interview with Frank. So let's walk through some of the episodes. The very first one, I told you, this one had 50,000 downloads, and it was called He Confessed to 93 Murders. That's the name of the first episode. And I deliberately wanted to appeal to this kind of very popular genre out there of movies and podcasts and books that have to do with behavioral analysis, profiling, and serial killers. There's almost an insatiable appetite for this out there. And I thought, what better way to kick off than to talk about the case of a guy named Sam Little. Sam Little confessed to 93 murders. He is considered the most prolific serial killer in United States history. And here's the thing. The FBI believes him. And law enforcement has only identified about 60 of his victims so far. That means, if you do the quick math, there are still 43 victims of Sam Little who have yet to be identified and linked to Sam Little. He's one of the strangest people that any law enforcement officer has ever interviewed. I've sent through some of the tapes of his interviews. If you have some time on your hands, you'll find some of the taped interviews on YouTube. They are fascinating. He becomes actually sexually aroused when he talks about his murders. He has a prolific, a steel trap mind when it comes to remembering details, and he's not a bad artist. So he will literally draw pictures of the faces of the women, describe in great deal where he found them, where he left them, That's why the FBI believes him. And of course, they've already confirmed 60 of his 93 murders, and they want the public's help. His victims, by and large, were transients, not all of them, but vulnerable people, not all with family members who would know that they have a family member missing. So justice is coming very slow to some of these victims, and they want the public's help. That's why they've gone public with the case of Sam Little. I kept with that serial killer behavioral analysis theme for the second episode. We talked to another behavioral crime analyst at Quantico, Virginia, where the FBI Academy is located. And if I could ask Scott to play a real short trailer promo of that second episode, you'll hear a little bit about what that sounds like.
Let's go inside the Bureau with Frank Figliuzzi.
It could be a stranded motorist, a hitchhiker, a prostitute.
Serial killings that involve some proximity to highways and that might involve common offenders.
The folks that we're looking at, unfortunately, are involved in the long-haul trucking industry.
The Highway Serial Killing Initiative.
What's left behind? A body. There's no evidence. There's no witnesses, because if they do it in the dark of night where there's no traffic, it's a challenge for law enforcement.
Wanted people, missing people.
They didn't want to have sex with them. They just wanted to kill someone.
So that's a little flavor of episode 2. And here's what that's called. It's called Long Haul, The Hunt for the Highway Serial Killers. And I will tell you, as much as we try to prepare with, and we're required to prepare questions and give and take with the FBI guest each week, I was not prepared for what this crime analyst shared with me about a third of the way through the interview, which is, and I made her repeat it. If you'll listen to the episode, you'll see that I said, excuse me, are you telling me what I think you're telling me? Because she said, Frank, I'm the head of the Highway Serial Killers Initiative at the FBI. And I said, what are you telling me? Are there unsolved murders alongside our nation's highways that require an initiative from the FBI? She said, Frank, there are hundreds of unsolved highway serial killings in such close proximity that they include mostly rest stop kidnappings, bodies being dumped along interstate highways. It's been going on for years. And despite the fact that dozens of long haul truckers have been arrested for these crimes over history, many of them good for multiple murders, the backlog of cases remains unsolved. They're still happening, and they're still unsolved, and there's still people out there. And I wanted, you can see how our society has trained us. I wanted to sound politically correct. So I said to her, now you're certainly not saying that these are all done by long haul truckers. We don't want to say that now, do we? And she said, no, Frank, that is exactly what we believe is happening. We believe these are long haul truckers and that there are multiple serial killers out there amongst them. So if that's something that intrigues you, you might want to tune in to episode 2 and learn more about that. Again, we talk about something called victimology, the fact that the victims, again, in these cases, are some of the most transient, vulnerable. And I hate to use this word, but in the eyes of a killer, would be considered disposable. There's no family demanding justice, pounding their fist on the desk. Where is my daughter? Where is my sister? Where is my mother? These are often, not always, but often substance abusers, often truck stop prostitutes that are involved in this. And you can imagine how this scenario challenges law enforcement, because a trucker can pick someone up in one state, murder them in a second state just an hour later, dump them in a third state, all challenging jurisdiction, all making folks wonder if they work it, if it's the state troopers, if it's the city homicide, if it's some federal thing. It's exploiting gaps in jurisdictional coverage as well as exploiting these poor victims. So we dive into that. And the next one I've already shared with you is this topic of the FBI abroad, and it's episode 3 of our first season, and Scott can play that promo trailer for a taste of that episode as well.
Are there really FBI offices overseas?
We have officially 63 offices and about another 30 to 40 sub-offices all over the world.
There's hardship, there's learning entirely new cultures, languages.
I mean, we're not Jason Bourne busting down doors with guns drawn.
The kind of old cliche, the FBI is everywhere. Well, they pretty much are.
Is my family gonna be safe?
Yeah, we talked with a very senior deputy assistant director overseeing the entire FBI legal attache program. And there are some pretty neat things going on out there. And I love the fact that he himself has served in numerous foreign assignments. I think so many of us can relate to having leaders in our careers who never actually lived what the experience was in the field. But this guy has lived it and had numerous assignments, some nice, some not so pleasant. And he understands it. The FBI also has a major training mission abroad, by the way, just as there's a domestic US training academy and FBI academy in Quantico, Virginia, that trains not only FBI personnel, but trains executive level law enforcement. There is also an FBI training academy in Budapest, Hungary. That trains foreign police officers for leadership assignments. And that's how seriously committed the FBI is to getting it right, inculcating the rule of law outside the United States so that we can at least professionalize the cadre of law enforcement leaders out there that we deal with every day. Some folks say, well, you've talked about how the majority of the FBI population is not gun and badge carrying special agents. Where are those in your podcast episodes? Well, I can tell you the first 2 episodes we just talked about, the 2 of them were serial killer episodes. Those 2 guests in that first and second episode were not agents. They were 2 women who were, their job title is crime analyst. And they are dedicated to a database called the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. And you want to talk about dedicated people who understand the nuances of crime scenes and understand how to find commonalities between seemingly disparate crime scenes and come up with a conclusion that this is the same person doing this. And here's why it's the same person. Those folks are the people you want to listen to. There's another episode, episode 4, again, a great example of a non-agent professional specialist. We talked to Dr. Liliana Moreno. She is a PhD scientist in the famous FBI laboratory. Her specialty is DNA. And this is another episode where I sat up in my chair and said, well, I didn't know this. And so that the issue there was that and I don't know if you folks know this, but there's something called rapid DNA. And it, by the way, it was used in the horrible tragedy in Surfside, Florida, where the condo building collapsed recently. It was used to identify the victims because they were able to gather samples from family members, and then where they found unidentifiable remains or body parts, they were able, using rapid DNA, to say that this is your loved one. And rapid DNA started a few years ago. It was beta tested in a hurricane in the Bahamas called Hurricane Dorian, where they said, the FBI lab said, you know what? We have been trying to perfect this rapid DNA, which, by the way, to define rapid is the ability to build your DNA profile and match it to some known DNA in the FBI's database in under 2 hours. So when I retired from the FBI, you were lucky if you could get that in 2 weeks. Maybe if you pushed hard, a few days. But the notion that today we can do this in 2 hours has amazing ramifications. And they perfected this with the mass casualty incident of Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, where again, family members provided DNA samples and FBI scientists hit the ground there and technicians and identified the remains for people and gave them closure. And in doing so, was able to perfect this theory of rapid DNA. Here's how it applies locally. The neat thing here is that they have now pushed this out. It's just gone online this summer, by the way, in police departments, certain selected police departments and FBI field offices. Could be one where you live, wherein if you are detained lawfully, about 30 states in the country mandate that if you're either arrested for certain felony offenses or convicted, but you're detained, the DNA sample is taken. It's usually a cheek swab. The FBI has sent that police department a kit. The technician or police officer sticks that swab that he's used to sample you in that kit. It digitalizes your DNA profile. It sends it to the FBI laboratory, and in less than 2 hours, which in most states is the legal hold before they have to kick you loose after questioning or something, they'll know whether your DNA was found on a rape scene, a murder scene, 10 years ago, 10 weeks ago, 10 hours ago, somewhere else. And it's fascinating technology. I would not be surprised if this eventually gets to police cars. And then, raises all kinds of interesting questions, and I'm sure you'll have questions later on. But Scott's got a trailer promo for Dr. Liliana Moreno from the FBI lab.
DNA is the blueprint of life.
Sitting there on a shelf saying, solve me.
Rapid DNA, it's essentially a miniature laboratory.
How much DNA does the FBI have on file?
And they develop that DNA profile within less than 2 hours.
Yeah.
This is unbelievable. And really, quite frankly, almost out of some science fiction movie.
There are millions of profiles.
A pretty neat episode and a pretty compelling story. One of the things I really enjoy about doing this podcast is I always ask the same question for the first question of my guests, which is I'm trying to put a human face on the FBI employee. And I always ask, tell us about your journey into the FBI, what you were doing before the Bureau and what you've been doing since you became an FBI employee. And I think, they're all compelling stories, by the way. Many of the guests I have were motivated to apply to the FBI because of 9/11. That is a very common theme. Another common theme is many of them have members and family members in law enforcement that influenced their lives. Dr. Moreno has an incredibly compelling story coming out of poverty in Puerto Rico, going to medical school, then deciding to divert her path to Miami, becoming an intern in the lab, and then working her way up all the way to a PhD and becoming one of the top DNA specialists in the United States. It's really, I love these personal stories that we really never hear from the FBI employees, certainly not in the media or as portrayed in movies or television. Episode 5, this has sadly become a real concern among so many of us, particularly where we see January 6th and the violence that played out at our Capitol that day. Many of us wondering, is my loved one, my neighbor, my coworker, my crazy uncle Bill, are they headed to violence? What are the warning signs and indicators that someone I know, that my gut instinct that tells me this person is headed to violence? How do I know if that's accurate? How do I know if my gut is right? When is it time to report this or get this person to a professional for help? We devoted an entire episode 5, called The Path to Violence. And we talked to the head of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit Threat Analysis Center. They study every single mass attack in the United States, all the horrible school shootings, workplace shootings, and they deploy. They've been on the ground, whether it's the Pulse nightclub shooting, or the horrible Parkland, Florida, Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, whether it's Newtown, Connecticut, and the Sandy Hook school there, the Las Vegas concert shooting. They study every single one of them. They release academic research, and they glean common findings. And this episode shares some of those thoughts and findings, so that you people like you and I can say, I'm seeing the warning signs and indicators in this person. Scott has a promo trailer for that episode as well.
Parkland, El Paso, Vegas.
Listening right now, someone may have some deep concerns about a coworker, neighbor, even a family member.
These offenders, as they plan, prepare, and consider for their attack, don't do that in a vacuum.
What makes violent people tick?
A sense of growing desperation or hopelessness.
And you feel certain that something bad would have happened but for that intervention.
If they've never done an attack before, they're going to have to learn how to do it.
Get inside the heads of those who do this.
What's driving this particular person down that pathway?
Yeah, I would urge you, if you listen to no other episode, I feel almost a public service compulsion to say, look, we should all be educated. Our society today, more than ever, needs this kind of education on what is it? What's the language of despondency? We talk about that. What are the words that coming out of someone's mouth should tell us that this person's on the verge, and how we act before that flashpoint occurs. I'd encourage you to tune in to that one. Episode 6, I call the bomb collectors. A lot of folks don't know this either, but the FBI has perhaps the most volatile, dangerous collection of things in the world, and it's the bomb collection. They literally have a warehouse in Alabama that is filled with both unexploded IEDs from Iraq, Afghanistan, everywhere in the world that they can get their hands on, and exploded IEDs, where they take the bomb fragments. It's called the Terrorist Explosive Device Analytical Center. It's in Huntsville, Alabama. And they're able to not only reconstruct these bombs. A lot of folks don't know that FBI evidence technicians and bomb technicians were deployed boots on the ground to Afghanistan and Iraq, and actually were at the scenes of IED explosions. And they were the ones collecting the bits when they were exploded, fragments. And they were the ones saying, we know who did this, because it's the same construction methodology as we saw over here in this one. And they give an example in this episode of 9 years later, tying someone to a bomb that was 9 years old. Fascinating work. We talk about whether there is such a thing as a bomb signature, so to speak, that bomb makers have that might make it unique to them, and what the difference is there. But they do incredible work, especially since 9/11. But if a bomb's gone off, including Nashville, you may remember, was it Christmas morning or Christmas Eve morning? I know I recall that because I was called to go immediately on television and talk about the Nashville bombing downtown, where that truck, the recreational vehicle, exploded early in the morning downtown. They were there. That bomb, by the way, scares them to no end, because it's that bomb took a lot of rehearsal and practice, and may well be a hyperbaric bomb, a gas fuel mixture, an air fuel mixture that really has not been perfected in the United States. And these are the folks who figure that out. It's fascinating work. Episode 7, I called it, the name of the episode 7 is What Happens on My Device Stays on My Device. And That is because we all increasingly understand that everything we do online, on our phones, on our laptops, it's all there forever, even if you think it's not. So we go inside. This was our first field office visit in the podcast. We went to this episode took us to Kansas City in the Regional Computer Forensic Lab there. The FBI has certain strategically located computer forensic labs that handle the mountains of digital evidence in all crimes now. All crimes you got to grab a cell phone, a laptop. Imagine a white collar crime case where you're seizing servers of a large corporation or hospital or healthcare system in a fraud case. Someone's got to process all of that. And you're seeing that in the January 6th riots investigation, where everybody was streaming live on Facebook or taking photos of themselves on their smartphones. There's body-worn cameras of police officers. There's facial recognition security cameras in the Capitol. All of that has to be processed. They're just starting to go through that. It's the tip of the iceberg digitally right now today. And we go inside and talk with the head of that regional computer forensics lab at FBI Kansas City. And she shared a story there of, imagine this, how many of us have dropped our cell phone in water, and that's the end of that, right? We may try to open it up and pack it in rice and pray, but they tell the story of recovering a cell phone off of a woman who was found in her car, deceased, submerged in a pond for weeks. They recovered the data off her phone. It was a laborious, methodical technique that they've perfected on how they go about doing that. It's not something you and I can do at home, that's for sure. But if you're interested in that kind of thing, that's the episode for you. And again, another episode 8, where I learned something I didn't know. I devoted an entire episode to biometrics. I call the episode "Look Into My Eyes," because the future of biometrics, meaning how, ways to identify humans from our bodies, is no longer, at least for our grandkids, is not going to be about fingerprints. Fingerprints are unique, they're special, they're significant. But I have a feeling our grandkids are going to look at us and laugh when they hear about fingerprints. They're going to look at it like the rotary phone, because the future of biometric identification is facial recognition and iris scans. Iris scans will become the way we identify each other. And we talk about some fun things there. So the biometrics section at FBI actually attends something called the Twin Festival every year in Twinsburg, Ohio, where they go and study identical twins and fraternal twins, and they try to perfect identification. And we answer the question, I won't give it away, but we answer the question on here about whether or not identical twins have different fingerprints. I'll let you find out on your own on that one. And we learn that the FBI can now match a fingerprint in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Back when I started in the FBI in 1987, we would do the old paper and ink and get our hands totally black, and yours as well. We'd send a paper card, we'd ship it off, or if we were lucky enough, fax it to a lab examiner in Washington, who would maybe come up with a fairly accurate match and tell us, yep, that's I think I've classified this. And that would take, weeks to get that back. 8 minutes now, we can digitally match a fingerprint to the millions of prints in the FBI database. And we answer the question, as to many people who ask, are my prints on file at the FBI? And we walk you through whether or not that's likely or not, mostly depending on where you've worked and where you've been printed before for various jobs and things. Episode 9, we spent time in this episode talking to the head of the FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia. And I wanted to take the listeners inside the academy, in the hallways. I wanted to walk through what training is like, not only for the special agents, as the training that I went through and how that's changed since I went through, but also for intelligence analysts and other employees who now go through the program at Quantico. And that wasn't the case prior to 9/11. I love the fact that early into your training as an agent or as an intelligence analyst, you will marry up with the other job description. The agent and the analyst will come together in their new classes at the academy and start working cases, mock cases together at the academy. So that when eventually they get assigned to a field office and they hit that door in the field office, they are already quite familiar with what each of them brings to the table. And it's a fascinating partnership that they've developed there at the academy. And I've got a real neat video here. It's real short, that gives you a taste of life at the FBI Academy as a new agent trainee.
What we'll do is, if they're there, we'll pull them out into the staircase outside. We'll clear that first room and gain a good foothold in that first room, and then we'll kind of use that as both a casualty collection point and a detail.
Many of the students here find the law enforcement skills portion of our training very demanding. We want to closely replicate what we think people are going to see in the field.
FBI, search warrant, open the door!
Our tactical instructors here look to develop scenarios based off of real cases. So a scenario over in Hogan's Alley, which is where our tactical training is conducted, is going to closely mirror what our instructors have seen during their experiences.
Hogan's Alley has been here 30 years. It's something that kind of bonds all agents who've come through. You know, we have a bank, we have a pawn shop, we have a pool hall, we have houses, we have a hotel as well. So all different scenarios hit different venues. And it really makes it very realistic.
Hogan's Alley is really, for us, where rubber meets the road. You encounter scenarios that you might have seen on TV, except for it feels real different when you're in it, and the way you respond, the movements that you make, kind of the muscle memory that they start to teach you.
The scenarios we've developed are all from actual agent cases and events that have occurred. They have to arrest fugitives, they have to do surveillance, and use all the techniques that we give them in the first 3 meetings here. So it's invaluable for them. This is the most important, most realistic, and prepares them the most for what they're going to see out in the field.
Thank you, Scott. That's the episode we call Conquering Quantico. Particularly if you've got a young person who might be interested, I'd recommend episode 9 to them. Tomorrow is Tuesday. That means we have a new episode coming out. It'll be episode 10, and that is devoted to the FBI's evidence response teams. If you're a fan of those CSI crime scene shows, this episode will be for you. And we talked to a supervisor who literally has been there, done that on every major high-profile crime scene in modern FBI history. He's been on the ground there. You name the crime scene, including the Boston Marathon bombing. He's been a leader in developing the crime scene and collecting the evidence. I want to close with one more video, and that is episode 11, and that is the FBI in Indian country. And many people don't even think that or even understand that you're talking about federal jurisdiction at Native American reservations. And It is highly specialized work. It is very isolated work. You don't have backup 10 minutes away. It's you on a large, remote, often desolate reservation. And the crimes there are quite challenging. And I'll leave you with this before we get to our questions.
Country in New Mexico is very unique, that it is very diverse. Native American pueblos or reservations in the state of New Mexico. Land mass in our state is Indian country with a unique jurisdictional relationship for the FBI.
It's truly frontline. It's truly, though, also relying on your own resources, your own wits to get the job done, because you don't have a lot of backup.
FBI is quite well skilled in doing investigations, so we combine both our skill sets, and that expedites cases quite well.
We almost invariably just see the bad side. We're only encountering people that have committed the crime or living, aren't exactly living the best type of life.
Our overseas mission, but here's a community that they get into. They know that, again, they're going to have to be alone sometimes in doing that, but they are some of the most exceptional investigators, but also community representatives that we have in the Bureau.
Thank you, Scott. And I'll just note that that'll be episode 11 of this season. The last episode of this season will be, I said to FBI headquarters, hey, I want to do an episode involving a border office. Let's talk about the action on the border. And lo and behold, they gave me Buffalo, New York, the FBI office in Buffalo, New York. We don't think of the Canadian border as a challenge for national security, crime, terrorism, espionage, but the Joint Terrorism Task Force in FBI Buffalo is one of the most active and successful in the nation. And the last episode of this season will take us to FBI Buffalo. So some early thoughts. I'll give you you'll be the first people to know some of the thoughts we're having about topics for the next season. And then if you've got some, include them in your chat or in your question to me. But already we're going to be doing episodes on FBI canines, some really cool stuff about how FBI trains the dogs, and all kinds of dogs. Again, I've learned some things. We all know about cadaver dogs and drug dogs and bomb dogs, but you can train a dog to find almost anything, including high-tech computer parts, laptops, USB and drives. We're going to do an episode on FBI SWAT teams. You don't hear a lot about that. We're going to go to FBI Honolulu for an episode and talk about what it's like, kind of a Hawaii 5-0 episode, so to speak. And we got a whole episode on recruitment of all kinds of job roles in the FBI, and always looking for your ideas about what you'd like to see emphasized. With that, Scott, let's go to some of the questions of our participants.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it again, having you here, Frank. And I took the liberty of checking out some of your episodes over the weekend and really enjoyed it. And I think the humanization side of it, especially, frankly, it's a need for any government worker these days. I think it's really critical, and appreciate that side of it. But it's a very interesting listen. We do have a link to how to use podcasts and all that we'll share as well. But we have a number of questions that have come in. trying to kind of moderate these by topic area, but there's a number of kind of functional questions. So our first one is Eric Heisler. You had a couple kind of functional questions. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. Eric, are you there? All right.
No, I'm here.
Here he is.
Yeah, here. Hey. What does a starting agent make?
Yep, good question. So it's more complicated than you think, because it depends. The answer, as usual, frustratingly, is it depends. It depends on location. So there is geographic pay, and thankfully a recognition that some of our American cities are far more expensive to live in than others. So if you're headed to New York, LA, Honolulu, San Francisco, Chicago, etc., you're going to get geographic pay that helps tremendously. The other thing is that there's something called availability pay. Now you're going to be afraid you asked this question, but years ago under J. Edgar Hoover, the short answer is an FBI special agent starts at the GS-10 level, and you can look it up at federal pay. But there's something called availability pay, which is that Congress figured out long ago that there was no way to keep up with the overtime for FBI agents. They don't go home at 5. The surveillance doesn't stop. Banks get robbed on Saturdays. Kidnappings occur on holidays. They cried mercy. Congress did when they to Hoover, and they came up with an agreement, which is that you get 20 to 25% of your salary gets added to your pay, no questions asked, automatically, because they know that there's no way to keep up with the overtime of an FBI agent. So when I say GS-10, add 25% to that. So you're really making decent money. But I will say this: the FBI agent position and almost all positions are filled with people who are career changers. They were lawyers, accountants, scientists in the private sector, and they've had it with either an unsatisfying job or an unethical environment. They want to be part of something bigger than themselves, and they sign up for the FBI. They could be making a lot more money in the private sector. So it's not about the money, but the money is a decent living.
I think, Eric, you had another question about.
Yes, yeah, I didn't couch this very well when I typed it in there, but this may be ancient history, but I've read books like The Looming Tower about the uncooperation between the FBI and the CIA, and how the ball was dropped big time with the investigation of the 9/11 terrorists. I'm just wondering what your reflection is now between the cooperation between the various intelligence gathering agencies. Are we still in a bunch of silos, or are we now cooperating so where one agency can help the other?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a valid question. So here's the short answer: major improvement in relations, and George W. Bush is to thank for saying, when he heard all this that you're talking about briefed to him, right? Hey, the FBI didn't get told that these guys were here, and this didn't get shared. Yes, it did. No, it didn't. He said, I've had enough of that. The entire counterterrorism function of the United States government is going to sit under one roof. There's a place in Northern Virginia where it sits. It's CIA, FBI, and others, elbow to elbow, cubicle to cubicle, working out in the same gym, eating in the same cafeteria, and complete visibility and transparency when it comes to counterterrorism matters. People get it, that we cannot afford unhealthy competition, territorial turf battles, or not sharing when it comes to counterterrorism. Is it all fixed? No, it's not all fixed, but I can tell you in my career, I saw it firsthand change, where if it was terrorism, you stopped everything you were doing, you shared everything you had, and it works quite well. I am increasingly concerned, I mentioned in the beginning where the FBI sits in the government. It sits in the Department of Justice with some other federal agencies. It does not sit in the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after 9/11, as you know. And just kind of, I'm going to insert some personal opinion here. It was created in kind of a knee-jerk, fast reaction that, hey, we got to fix this. Everybody's going under one roof. Well, it wasn't everybody. It was some disparate agencies like Coast Guard, ICE, Border Patrol, TSA, Secret Service, and it's unwieldy and it's enormous. It's enormous. And I get concerned as to whether or not it's so big that, not deliberately, but by accident, they might develop information that doesn't get shared with FBI or CIA or others. And I think, particularly when it comes to domestic terrorism, I'm not sure that that's streamlined right now.
And we actually had a comment. You mentioned that the anniversary of the FBI was July 26th, which happens to be today. And we couldn't have planned that if we wanted to.
I didn't catch that. Good.
113th anniversary, I guess.
Good catch.
So Luann Barrett, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
I have several questions. One of them, when you were doing the video on the Native American reservations, I don't remember the exact numbers, but a lot fewer of them had FBI jurisdiction than the total number of reservations. And I was wondering why that is.
Some of this has been worked out with the Bureau of Indian Affairs as to whether or not there is, I don't want to say receptivity, but whether they fall under Bureau of Indian Affairs or not, whether they accept federal funding or not, plays a role in the FBI's jurisdiction there. Whether they, the bottom line is that the jurisdiction will exist if the federal government decides it needs to exist. But on the other hand, if indeed that reservation falls under county, which is rare, county or state authorities, many reservations, have tribal police who do a great job locally on the reservation, but do not handle felonies generally at all. But this has a lot to do with funding and jurisdiction under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, whether the population is large enough or not, or whether the population is so large that it essentially is a city unto itself. I'm thinking kind of like the Mohawk Reservation in upstate New York that is just so large that it's almost unrecognizable when you've come on or off the reservation. It's part of the city. So it's a long way of answering. It's a complicated bureaucratic answer, but it has, as usual, it has to do with money and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and whether or not that tribe or reservation has some other way of enforcing the law.
Thank you.
And I think Luann had another question about U.S. Marshals, as I recall. Do you want to ask that one?
Yeah, let's see. That was like the first one. I think it pertained to that. Do they also have investigative services, or do they only come on board for arrests?
So the short answer is their investigative jurisdiction involves their very limited remit, which is they protect the U.S. court systems, no small task. Transport federal prisoners, federal courthouse protection, federal protection for federal judges, and a huge role. They are the #1 fugitive apprehension agency in the United States government. So as their investigations pertain to finding where a fugitive is, investigating threats to judges and courthouses, investigating prisoner activity, that's the Marshals. They do that incredibly well. And over the years, particularly since 9/11, the FBI has virtually not ceded, but said to the Marshals, hey, you've got this on the fugitives. We'll work FBI fugitives, but you've got this fugitive thing down and that's yours.
Our next question is from Steve Mizell. Steve, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, there are two questions. Thank you for your podcast actually you're appearing today. One is regarding undercover agents. What psychological training are they given? Because I can't imagine what it takes to do that job, and it's very courageous that people do volunteer to do that. And the other question was, I guess, historical. I think we all know about J. Edgar Hoover's illegal activities in the use of the FBI to spy on American citizens, Martin Luther King, civil rights activists, people like that. What has been put in place to prevent that kind of thing from happening again?
Yeah, two good questions. Okay, so undercover work is voluntary in the FBI, particularly if you're talking about long-term undercover work, right? Many of us have had the experience of doing what we call pretext covers, short-term undercover work. But if you're talking about inserting yourself in a criminal organization, particularly for a long term, that's voluntary only. And the selection process is arduous. So you're going to go through a lengthy selection and vetting process that involves psychological testing, personality testing, and making certain that this is a role that fits with you and your personality. And I have to tell you, it's extremely difficult work because, in part, you're taking, FBI agents have been through the most stringent testing, polygraph exams, background investigations. You're essentially getting Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts who are pristine. And then you're asking them to play a mobster or a drug dealer for 6 months or a year or longer. Incredibly difficult challenges. And there are certain syndromes. I talk about this in my book. There are certain repercussions of being undercover too long, and how your mind tries to compensate for how a good person tries to compensate for doing really bad things, right? Pretending to do really bad things. Some bad things will manifest themselves. So certain things are in place. For example, you're assigned a handling agent. You're required to check in with your handling agent very, very frequently. You're tested. You talk with other undercover agents in a group setting, almost kind of a therapeutic setting, to talk about what you're experiencing. But there's kind of almost micromanagement, and it's very, very necessary. If you have a family, there are times carved out, and it has to be done very carefully to get you away from what you're doing and get you to a remote visit with your family, to remind you that you have a foundation, you're still anchored in that foundation. Very difficult, challenging work. I've seen some incredible undercover agents in my career who can talk their way into and out of just about anything. Though that's part of the training and the vetting, by the way. What do you do when you're inside a drug dealer's house and someone says, hey, we're all going to snort some lines of cocaine right now? How do you handle that? How do you talk your way out of that? What do you do if you're strip searched and someone's looking for a hidden microphone somewhere, that's secreted? How do you do all of that? That's a skill set that not everybody has. With regard to Hoover and that era, that included, so it's funny. It's not funny, but Hoover was the father of modern day law enforcement. So many of us could rattle off the things that Hoover did and started that made the FBI what it is today from a modern law enforcement agency. The FBI lab, the concept of fingerprints, really, and sort of, creating a repository of fingerprints, all great things. But you are absolutely right. There were abuses and exploitations, sometimes merely because Hoover saw a threat where there might not have been no threat. And I think, or no threat, or no threat worthy of his response. The Black Panther organization is an example of that. Abuses regarding MLK are examples of that. And by the way, wiretapping, in many cases without court authorization, even to go so far as to extort people he thought were threats and say, I have this on you. If you don't go away, this is going to come out. And of course, 40 years of power. Hoover was the director for 40 years. The joke in Washington was, if you've seen one FBI director, you've seen them all. That is too long a time. You know, I talked earlier about how the FBI director has a 10-year term and is to ensure that he doesn't serve at the whim of the president. But there's another reason for that, which is you don't want it to be any longer than that. The FBI is a very powerful organization. And if the director is in power for 40 years, he will own the town. And that's not healthy either. So what's happened? Well, good news, there are laws now in place requiring, and there's congressional monitoring of this and Department of Justice monitoring. If you're going to wiretap somebody, it has to go to court. It has to get approved by a judge. It has to get re-upped regularly, and you have to show that you're making progress on this. There are guidelines, strict Attorney General guidelines on opening domestic security investigations. I like to argue that, because I'm a big advocate of the fact that we need a domestic terrorism law in the United States. We don't have one. And people go, oh my gosh, that scares me, Frank. I don't know if we want a domestic terrorism law that could be abused. And I go, well, let's go back to J. Edgar Hoover's era where there was no law at all, right? And look what he did with no ability to point to a law to rein him in. If he decided the Black Panthers were a threat, if he decided MLK was a threat, and by the way, there were indications of threat there. I get it, but he went way off the charts on behavior that we must never see again. And I argue that it's having a law in place that would actually help with that. So lots of regulations, guidelines, oversight that simply did not exist, curtailing of FBI authorities and powers, strict guidelines on what is needed to open a case, even open a preliminary inquiry and move it to a full investigation, and then showing your work every 60 to 90 days before you can continue. Informant development, tightly regulated, lots and lots of changes to minimize the abuses. Will they never happen again? I can't promise that, but we need to demand that from the highest law enforcement agency in our country.
We have a lot of questions around domestic terrorism, so thanks for bringing that up. And our next question comes from Susan Rubin. Susan, if you'd like to unmute yourself, kind of related to that topic.
Yeah, I was interested in what the FBI is doing or thinking about the issue of domestic terrorism within the ranks. I know the military has begun to talk about that, particularly in the idea of white nationalism. So I'm not sure how the FBI is handling that within its own ranks.
Every law enforcement agency, whether it's local, county, state, or federal, should be addressing the question of whether racism, white nationalism, conspiracy theorists are present within their ranks. I think we're into the dozens of law enforcement officers who have been arrested for participating in the riots on January 6th. There are even more military, both active and retired, associated with that insurrection. And it needs to become part of the vetting process. That means that it's going to cost some money to get this right. So some of the things that federal law enforcement agencies have instituted include social media monitoring. This isn't cheap, and with regard to local police departments, it's going to send unions into orbit on the notion that a law enforcement officer would have to disclose his or her social media accounts, Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, and openly agree to not create alias accounts. And it's extremely difficult. But where there is, just so you know, the FBI has no such union protections. It's an accepted service. And so that is being done on the federal level for federal law enforcement. There is social media monitoring. Things are being included into polygraph exams now, which are required when you come on board, even most local police departments. And then you're polygraphed at least every 5 years during your career in the FBI. It's being those kind of domestic extremism questions about affiliation with terror groups, hate-based violence, right? It's not, and there's a real challenge here. You do not want to test and quiz and polygraph people on their ideology or political affiliations or beliefs, but rather you want to focus on violence, focus on actions, and not on ideologies, but it can be done. It must be done. And polygraph systems are being pitched right now to police departments to do that. And the social media monitoring before someone enters a union at the police level. So you're applying for that police job locally. That's the time where now I see police departments saying, this is our time. This is the gatekeeping function we have. We're going to be asking, and we're going to be including this look in our background investigation, right down to tattoos. You know, what does this tattoo mean? What is this affiliation you have? And including those questions on background. So the military is a tougher nut to crack, a huge population. And they're trying everything they can do to right that ship in terms of violent ideology and hatred and race-based extremism. I do get worried about the pipeline that exists from military to police work. There's a rightful bump that candidates get when they have military experience. I get that. If they've served our nation, they should get a bump on the test process for police officer. On the other hand, the US military has acknowledged that it currently has a domestic extremism, white nationalism problem. And so the police departments better be very careful when they're accepting people from that pipeline, that they're not bringing on a problem that they don't need to have.
We're running out of time, but I'd be remiss in not bringing on Mr. Ron Cohen to ask a question, since he is responsible for helping bring you to our program. So Ron, take it away.
Hi, Frank.
Hi, Ron.
First, I'm going to make a comment, and that is the FBI way is not just informative, but it's also a thriller. So I enjoyed reading it very much.
Thank you.
The question I have really isn't about 9/11. It's really about 1/6. And the question is, knowing that the FBI works under the Attorney General, what is the FBI's role in working on 1/6 under the Attorney General? You know, are they just investigating people, or are they doing more?
Well, I want to try and make sure I understand the question. I think, tell me if I'm wrong, Ron, but at the heart of your question, are you saying that does the FBI's inquiry include the possibility that they'd be looking at the role of certain officials, members of Congress, former presidents, cohorts in inciting the violence that day? Is that where you're going?
No, I'm looking at the people who did the violence, and my question is, who is identifying and arresting them?
Oh, that's the FBI. Yeah. So we're getting close to 600 people who have been federally indicted. Virtually all of those arrests are FBI arrests. It is the largest, depending on how you look at it, it's arguably the largest investigation in FBI history because of the number of defendants involved. Every single FBI field office, with I believe the exception of Honolulu, has a piece of this case and has made arrests. But these are high risk. Almost all of them are tactical arrests. Here in Arizona, I know FBI Phoenix has been making, unfortunately, a number of tactical arrests because they're considered high risk people. that were inside the building committing violence on January 6th. Yeah, every single one of the FBI officers, with maybe one exception. These are all FBI arrests. These are all federal charges, and people will be going to federal prison. As we saw in the first felony sentence handed out last week, I believe, which was for someone who did not actually act out violently inside. He pled guilty early, no criminal history whatsoever. He's still going to federal prison for 8 months. That was the first felony sentence we've seen. But yeah, all FBI, all Department of Justice.
Thanks, Frank.
Yep, thank you.
And it sounds like you're going to have a busy week ahead of you, probably addressing this on MSNBC and other places.
I'm glad. Yeah, I am glad we could do this today. Tomorrow, I am all MSNBC. I've got at least 3 appearances because tomorrow the Select Committee on January 6th begins its hearing. So I'm on the air at 6 a.m. Arizona time tomorrow morning.
I guess last thing, we had a number of questions. It must be a breaking story about the FBI's role in investigating Judge Kavanaugh. Do you know much about what's going on with that?
I do, and I have written a column. One of the things I do, besides be a talking head, is I write a regular column for MSNBC Daily, which is there, and you can sign up for my column. It's their online digital platform to get deeper into stories. So I actually wrote a column way back when Justice Kavanaugh was being confirmed, and all of this came up about his background. And so, very long story short, what's made the news recently is that there were, I don't know, about 4,500 tips that came into an FBI tip line created for the specific purpose of gleaning public information about Justice Kavanaugh and the allegations against him. Justice Kavanaugh has been a federal judge, so he has had FBI background investigations before he was nominated to be on the Supreme Court. So all that was required was an update of his federal background investigation. But here's the thing that many Americans don't know, and I've seen a lot of outrage recently on this with the FBI, but I'm here to tell you, as I say in my column, you need to understand the rules of the road. Unlike anything else the FBI does, when they're asked to redo a background investigation, there is a client relationship with the White House. There is actually a rule that says that the requesting agency, which in this case for a Supreme Court justice is the White House, who's requesting the background be redone, gets to set the parameters of the background. And it appears that in the case of Kavanaugh, the White House literally said, do this, but not that. Talk to these people, but not that woman. And it was very constrained. And while people are outraged when they hear, oh my God, there were 4,500 tips that came in and the FBI gave them all to the White House. Well, guess what? They've never created a tip line before in the history of background investigations. My experience and my gut tells me this was a way for the FBI to say to the White House, oh yeah, you're constraining what we do in a Supreme Court reinvestigation? Okay, we're gonna request public input, and here's 4,500 tips on Kavanaugh. Knock yourself out, client. But this client relationship has to stop. This rule has to go. And what I hope comes out of this mess is that Congress and the White House agree that the FBI needs to work at all times with the American people as their client, not the White House as their client. In no other work the FBI does is there anybody that's a client other than the American people, except the reinvestigation of a background. So this needs to get fixed. And we've got this question of what do you do with 4,500 tips about Kavanaugh sitting somewhere in some file in the former Trump administration? That needs to get addressed.
Well, I think we are way past time and really appreciate you staying on with us. And we could have questions for another hour, I think, but really appreciate the presentation. Again, I highly suggest people check out the podcast, and we'll talk more about how to podcast for those that aren't interested or are interested but don't know how. But there's a wide variety of ways you can do it, from your own phone and listen in your car and on your TV, and it's a great medium that I think Ollie members would really enjoy if you're not utilizing it already. And you can go to Frank's link there. We put in there the right off his webpage, where you can just listen to them directly and don't need any special mumbo jumbo to make it happen. But Frank, again, thank you so much. Appreciate everybody for joining us today, and want to invite everybody back in 2 more weeks. But any parting words, sir?
This was a great conversation. I'm passionate about the public perception of the Bureau, and I'm passionate about the FBI getting it right, because we have to have them get it right. These are challenging times. Thanks for caring, everybody, about the topic. Thanks for all you do. Stay healthy, and I'll see you soon.
All right, everybody take care, be well, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.